It started with a joke. Americans, one German colonel said in 1944, they think they can paint victory. He wasn't entirely wrong. On the surface, it sounded absurd. An entire U.S. Army division made up of actors, sound engineers, and set designers. No tanks, no artillery, no infantry, just rubber, wood, and noise. But that absurdity was the point. The Germans never understood what they were up against until it was far too late. They had spent years studying the hardware of war, engines, calibers, armor thickness, and suddenly they were fighting ghosts. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't look like an army. They looked like a circus that had stolen uniforms. Artists from New York, radio operators from Hollywood, sound technicians from Broadway theaters. Their commander, Colonel Harry Reeder, once described them as a traveling roadshow with a security clearance. Their mission was both simple and impossible. Make the enemy believe in what didn't exist. By mid-1944, the Allies were advancing through France, but every mile gained brought new danger. The Germans were masters of reconnaissance. A single Luftwaffe overflight could reveal troop movements, tank concentrations, and artillery positions, and the next day, the sky would rain fire. So the Allies built an army of ghosts. It began as a handful of experiments after D-Day. A few fake tanks here, some dummy artillery there, enough to confuse, not to convince. But when the deception actually delayed a German counterattack near Normandy, command realized they had stumbled onto something extraordinary. By the time the 23rd went fully operational, it had over 1,000 men and a toolkit straight out of a magician's handbook. Inflatable Sherman tanks that could be carried by 4 men and set up in 20 minutes, rubber jeeps, wooden artillery, cardboard airplanes that glinted like metal under sunlight. From the air, they were perfect. From a distance, they were deadly. The men called themselves the Ghost Army. They had their own artist's humor. War by Hollywood, they called it. They painted fake insignia on trucks, broadcast false radio chatter, even drove in circles to leave the illusion of thousands of troops on the move. To the Germans, who depended on observation reports and intercepted radio signals, it looked like entire divisions materializing overnight. Colonel Reeder put it bluntly, "We don't kill the enemy, we confuse him to death." Their first big test came in August 1944, as General Patton's Third Army pushed through France. Patton was moving fast, too fast, leaving his flanks exposed. The Ghost Army was ordered to cover his left side using nothing but deception. They rolled out 20 rubber tanks along the Loire River. Loudspeakers blasted the sound of engines idling, treads grinding, and shouted orders. At night, they lit fake campfires and truck headlights in perfectly measured patterns. From the air, it looked exactly like a real armored column. The Germans took the bait. Recon planes reported significant U.S. armor buildup near the Loire. Panzer divisions were diverted south to counter an army that didn't exist. Patton's real units advanced unopposed. That's when command realized what they had created. Not a trick, not a gimmick. A new kind of weapon. One that didn't need bullets, only belief. The men of the Ghost Army began to refine their craft. They learned to imitate entire regiments. Each operation had layers. Visual deception with fake tanks and vehicles placed according to doctrine. Sonic deception using 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks to project the sounds of armored convoys up to 15 miles away. Radio deception with trained operators mimicking the chatter of real divisions, down to the quirks of individual sergeants. It was theater on a battlefield scale. The actors wore the same patches as nearby divisions, swapped license plates, even staged fake patrols for enemy spies to accidentally witness. Sometimes, it got dangerously convincing. One night, while posing as the 6th Armored Division, a Ghost Army unit was approached by a real Allied MP patrol who demanded identification. The officer in charge flashed his fake credentials. The MPs arrested him for impersonating an officer until a major arrived and whispered, "He's supposed to be impersonating one." Even among their own allies, the line between real and fake was starting to blur. The Germans, meanwhile, were losing their grip on reality. Reports from frontline intelligence officers grew contradictory. Panzer commanders complained of phantom divisions appearing in 2 places at once. Luftwaffe pilots swore they'd seen armor formations that weren't there the next day. Some units changed course mid-march, chasing ghosts that vanished when they arrived. The German High Command called it Täuschungskrieg, the War of Deception. But deception was too polite a word. The Ghost Army had turned warfare into performance art. One of the sound engineers, Sergeant Jack Macy, described it best. It wasn't about making the enemy think we were strong. It was about making him doubt he knew anything at all. They'd found the psychological breaking point of a machine built on precision. The Wehrmacht's discipline depended on certainty. Clear orders, clear intelligence, clear maps. The Ghost Army erased all of that. By the fall of 1944, every German reconnaissance officer in Western Europe was afraid of shadows. The Allied front looked twice as large as it really was. Every crossroads, every village could be a trap, and the more the Germans second-guessed, the slower they moved. The Ghost Army didn't just fool them, it froze them. And the deeper the war went, the more powerful the illusions became. Because once you realize the enemy in front of you might be fake, you start to wonder what else isn't real. That was the moment German confidence cracked. Not under artillery, not under bombs, but under doubt. It was the beginning of the end. By December 1944, Europe was a maze of snow and smoke. The forests of the Ardennes lay quiet beneath a gray sky, the trees heavy with frost, the ground hard as iron. The war was supposed to be ending. The Germans were finished, or so the Allies thought. Then came the surprise, the Battle of the Bulge. The German counterattack hit like a hammer. Hundreds of tanks punched through the American lines, sowing chaos across Belgium. Communications collapsed. Units vanished. Towns changed hands 3 times in a day. The world turned white and red, snow and blood. And in that chaos, the Ghost Army went to work. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was ordered to create an illusion strong enough to hold off entire panzer divisions until reinforcements could arrive. It was insanity. They had no real tanks, no heavy guns, and barely 1,000 men. But they had their tools, rubber, sound, and imagination. They rolled out their fake tanks again, hundreds of inflatable Shermans anchored to the frozen ground with ropes. Men carried them across fields like giant sleeping beasts, setting them in perfect formation. They used hand pumps to inflate them, the cold air hissing into shapes of steel and death. From a few hundred yards away, they looked solid. From the air, they looked invincible. At night, they brought in the sound trucks. Massive speakers mounted on half-tracks broadcast pre-recorded audio of tanks rumbling, artillery firing, and soldiers shouting. The recordings were made in studios back in England by Hollywood sound engineers who had studied how real battles sounded across different terrains. They could simulate the movement of an entire armored division simply by adjusting volume and delay. For 3 nights, the forest echoed with the mechanical growl of a phantom army. Villagers swore they saw tanks on the roads that weren't there in the morning. German patrols reported large concentrations of armor near the Meuse River. Luftwaffe reconnaissance confirmed it. The Wehrmacht command shifted their forces to counter the threat, diverting entire battalions from the real front lines. When the Germans finally attacked, they found nothing. No tanks, no men, only deflated rubber and tire tracks leading nowhere. By then, the real American divisions had moved into position and slammed the door shut behind them. The Ghost Army had just saved thousands of lives with nothing but air. One German officer captured after the battle said, bewildered, "We thought we were fighting 3 American armies. It was 1." But it wasn't just the Germans who were fooled. Even some American units believed the deception. Soldiers marching past the fake tanks would salute them out of habit. A few tried to climb on for photographs, only to fall through the rubber hulls, laughing. The Ghost Army had become so good at lying that even reality started to believe them. Each mission was a high-wire act. The men worked within range of German artillery, often alone and exposed. They couldn't fire back. Their guns were props. If the enemy realized the trick, they would be slaughtered. And yet, time after time, they held the illusion. They started giving their fake divisions personalities. When posing as the 4th Armored, they swaggered through towns, drove jeeps in endless loops, left tire tracks and cigarette butts everywhere. When they impersonated the 9th Infantry, they grew quiet, avoided the locals, and staged religious services to match the real unit's reputation. It wasn't just about looking right. It was about feeling right. Every prop mattered. They built fake command tents with maps pinned to tables, fake kitchens with smoke rising from canvas chimneys, fake radio trucks humming with static. Sometimes they'd even leak fake documents for German spies to discover. The attention to detail was terrifying. The enemy never stood a chance. One day, a local farmer wandered into their camp and asked how many men were there. A soldier smiled and said 20,000. There were maybe 50 in sight. The farmer nodded solemnly and walked off. That night, the Germans shelled the area for 6 straight hours. When the smoke cleared, not a single man was dead. The shells had landed on ghosts. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the 23rd became the ultimate decoy. They led phantom invasions, built fake bridges across the Rhine, and even staged false retreats to lure enemy units into ambushes. They were actors, painters, magicians, and their stage was a continent at war. By March 1945, they were operating less than 10 miles from the front lines, pretending to be the 9th Army preparing to cross the Rhine at a town called Wesel. In reality, the real crossing was happening 20 miles away. To sell the illusion, they inflated hundreds of tanks, erected dummy artillery positions, and blasted hours of fake radio chatter. German scouts saw what they were meant to see. Command believed Wesel was the main crossing point and poured artillery and reserves into defending it. When the real attack came elsewhere, the line collapsed almost instantly. The Rhine was breached. Germany was open. When it was over, the Ghost Army quietly packed up and moved on. They never took credit. Most soldiers in Europe didn't even know they existed. Their records were classified for decades. After the war, when the files were finally declassified, generals admitted what the Germans never knew. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had conducted over 20 full-scale deception operations across Europe. Their fake divisions had tied down tens of thousands of German troops. Military historians later estimated their work saved between 15,000 and 30,000 Allied lives. The German officers who survived the war read about them years later and didn't know whether to laugh or weep. They had been outwitted not by superior firepower, but by a sketchpad and a loudspeaker. One former Wehrmacht colonel said in an interview, "We respected the American tanks. We feared their bombers. But the Ghost Army? That was witchcraft." He wasn't wrong. It was warfare stripped of violence, victory through illusion. And for the men who lived it, it changed the meaning of war forever. They had learned that in the modern age, bullets weren't always the sharpest weapon. Sometimes belief was deadlier, because once you can control what your enemy sees, you already control what he'll do next. And that's how the Ghost Army fought. With art instead of armor, sound instead of shells, imagination instead of fear. In a world where everything burned, they won by pretending to exist. When spring came in 1945, the snow melted into mud and wire, and Germany began to collapse under the weight of its own disbelief. The war was nearly over, but the ghosts still had work to do. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops moved like shadows, never staying long enough for anyone to know where they truly were. One week, they were the 2nd Armored Division, the next the 5th Infantry. To the Germans, they were everywhere. To the Americans, they were nowhere. They left behind nothing but tire tracks, footprints, and echoes. Their last great act was their most dangerous. The Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the final barrier before the heart of Germany, and needed to trick the Wehrmacht into defending the wrong place. It was suicide to fight the Germans head-on along the river, so the Ghost Army built another lie. They set up near a town called Wesel. The real crossing would happen miles away, at Remagen, but that secret had to be protected at all costs. The ghosts were told to look loud. They filled the countryside with decoys, hundreds of rubber Shermans, dummy trucks, and wooden artillery barrels that gleamed like steel in the spring sun. The engineers carved fake tank tracks through the mud. Painters created camouflage nets and fake shadows under the dummies to fool enemy spotters. At night, electricians wired fake headlights, lanterns, and signal flares. From the air, it was a masterpiece, an entire army gathering for a major assault. The sound crews brought in their greatest trick yet. They had new recordings from real tank battalions, engines revving, treads clanking, men shouting over the roar. They played them in loops, mixing the sound of trucks idling, chains rattling, even the echo of boots on steel bridges. The result was uncanny. Villagers miles away swore they could feel the ground tremble with the approach of armored columns that didn't exist. German reconnaissance planes flew overhead, snapping photos. Analysts in the Wehrmacht command rooms studied the images and nodded grimly. The Americans were clearly massing at Wesel. Orders went out. Concentrate artillery fire, move reinforcements, dig in. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, real American forces were quietly crossing the Rhine at Remagen, almost unopposed. By the time the Germans realized the truth, the bridge at Remagen was already in Allied hands, and the war was effectively over. The Ghost Army had just pulled off its final illusion. When the war ended weeks later, the men packed up their props and vanished as quietly as they had appeared. Their story was buried under classified stamps and secrecy oaths. There were no medals, no parades. Officially, they didn't exist. Even their families thought they were truck drivers, radio operators, or clerks. But they remembered what they had done. In the years after the war, some went back to painting, sculpting, designing buildings. Others worked in advertising or television, fields that understood the power of illusion. A few joined the newly formed CIA, where deception was no longer art, but doctrine. They had invented psychological warfare before anyone knew what to call it. The Germans, too, remembered them, though they didn't know who them really was. The captured records from Wehrmacht intelligence revealed the confusion in stark detail. Dozens of reports mentioned American divisions that had never existed. Field officers argued over maps that showed enemy units in two places at once. Some even accused each other of falsifying reconnaissance. There was a phrase that began appearing in late-war German communications: Schattenformationen, shadow formations, phantom divisions. The term stuck. It was how they made sense of the madness, the armies that moved by night, fought with silence, and disappeared with the dawn. Years later, when the Allied archives were opened and the truth came out, German veterans read about the Ghost Army in disbelief. A few laughed, the same way they had laughed when they first saw reports of rubber tanks. But the laughter didn't last long. One Wehrmacht officer who had fought near the Rhine wrote in his memoirs, "It is humiliating in hindsight to have been defeated by artists. But it is also poetic. They waged war with shadows, and the shadows won." He wasn't wrong. The Ghost Army had done what no artillery barrage or bombing run could do. They had dismantled German confidence. They had turned certainty into chaos, maps into lies, and logic into fear. Their legacy lived on in ways no one could have predicted. Modern armies would go on to study their techniques: decoys, radio deception, camouflage, misinformation, and refine them into an entire science. What the artists of 1944 built with paint and air would evolve into satellites and digital warfare. Every drone decoy, every false radar signal, every psychological operation in the modern era traces its lineage back to those men with rubber tanks and tape recorders. But at its heart, their story wasn't about technology. It was about imagination. It proved that war could be fought not just with steel, but with creativity. That perception itself could be weaponized. Decades later, surviving members of the Ghost Army gathered for a reunion. They were old now, gray-haired and slow-moving, but their eyes still had that glint of mischief. They laughed about the time they fooled their own generals, the time a cow punctured an inflatable tank, the time they almost got shelled because their illusion worked too well. Then someone asked the question that had lingered for half a century. Did we really win anything? There was a long silence. Finally, one of them said, "We didn't win the war. We helped others win it faster. And maybe we saved some boys from dying. That's enough." When the declassification finally came, the U.S. Army described the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops as a tactical deception unit that conducted operations of unusual imagination and bravery. Historians later called them the artists who fooled Hitler. But the men themselves had a different name for what they did. They called it noise. Noise loud enough to drown out the sound of death. Noise that saved lives. And in that noise, they discovered something the German officers never understood, that the most dangerous weapon on a battlefield isn't the gun you fire. It's the story your enemy believes. That was the Ghost Army's secret. They fought with mirrors. They killed with silence. And by the time the enemy realized the truth, there was nothing left to shoot at but shadows. When the war ended, the ghosts faded quietly into peace. Their unit was disbanded, their files sealed, their names erased from official memory. The world moved on to new headlines: Hiroshima, the Cold War, the Iron Curtain. And the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops went home, blending back into the ordinary America they had come from. No medals, no press, just silence. For decades, no one knew there had been an army of artists. Their children grew up thinking their fathers had spent the war behind desks. The men themselves rarely spoke about what they had done. You couldn't really explain it anyway. "We pretended to be an army and scared the Nazis," sounded like a bar joke. But the joke had been lethal. In the 1950s, a few of them began reconnecting. They found each other through art galleries, architecture firms, ad agencies. They laughed at how many of them had ended up in creative work again, as if they had been built for illusion. One of them, fashion designer Bill Blass, became famous for tailoring suits instead of uniforms. Another designed museum exhibits. A sound engineer went on to work for RCA, still manipulating noise. Their war never really ended. It just changed mediums. Behind the laughter, though, there was pride, and something darker. They knew what they'd done had saved lives, but they also knew it had broken something inside them. That fine line between truth and theater. Once you've made whole armies appear from nothing, it's hard to trust anything you see again. Years later, during the Cold War, the U.S. military quietly invited some of them back, not to fight, but to consult. They shared what they'd learned about deception, the timing, the psychology, the choreography of belief. Their ideas became doctrine, radar ghosts, dummy missile silos, false troop movements in Vietnam. It all started with the Ghost Army. Meanwhile, in Germany, the legend grew in whispers. Captured German officers, when interviewed by Allied historians, still couldn't believe it had all been fake. Some refused to believe it at all. One insisted that he had personally seen American tanks firing near Wesel. "You can't fake recoil," he said. He was wrong. The Ghost Army had rigged some of their inflatables with small explosive charges to mimic the flash of a gun. Another German veteran, years later, visited a museum where one of the rubber tanks was on display. He stood in front of it for a long time, shaking his head. "This," he said softly, "is what madness looks like. Beautiful madness." Back in the United States, the ghosts lived ordinary lives, but sometimes something would trigger a memory. A car backfiring would sound like artillery. A film reel, spinning too fast, would sound like their old sound trucks revving up. They would pause for a moment, half smile, half grimace, caught between pride and disbelief that it had all really happened. When they finally began speaking publicly about their work in the 1980s, people thought they were exaggerating, until the documents were declassified, until the photos surfaced, men grinning beside inflatable tanks, fake convoys stretching across French fields, radio trucks blasting recorded chaos into the night. Reporters came calling, documentaries were made, the world learned about the Ghost Army, and for a while people were astonished. Artists had beaten the Wehrmacht. Painters and sound men had saved armies. It sounded impossible, because it was. That was the point. By then most of the original members were old, but they spoke about their missions with a strange mixture of nostalgia and humility. "We didn't fight," one of them said. "We just lied better than anyone else." Another laughed and added, "We were the only soldiers who hoped the enemy would never find us." In the early 2000s, a group of historians and filmmakers began pushing for formal recognition. They argued that the Ghost Army had saved tens of thousands of lives, that their work had shortened the war, that they deserved medals like any other heroes. It took decades, but in 2022, 77 years after the war ended, the U.S. Congress finally awarded them the Congressional Gold Medal. Only a handful of them were still alive to receive it. When one of the survivors was interviewed at the ceremony, his voice cracked as he said, "We were ghosts then, and we're ghosts now." It was true, but even ghosts leave shadows. Their legacy lives on every time a modern army deploys a decoy tank, a false radar echo, or a disinformation campaign. Every time a drone projects a false signature or a digital army floods enemy sensors with illusions, the spirit of the 23rd Headquarters is there. Art as armor, sound as strategy, the theater of survival. They proved that imagination could be deadlier than firepower and that creativity could defend as well as destroy. The German officers had laughed once, laughed at the idea that a few artists and engineers could change the course of a war. They weren't laughing when their tanks chased mirages through the mud. The Ghost Army taught the world that war isn't just fought with guns and steel. It's fought in the mind, where fear multiplies faster than bullets. When you can make your enemy doubt what's real, you've already won. And that's what the Ghost Army did better than anyone before or since. They painted armies out of light. They built fortresses from rubber. They fought with silence, and they won with shadows. At the edge of every war, there's always someone watching, wondering what's real. That's the moment the ghosts still wait for, quiet, unseen, ready to make the world believe again. Because their greatest weapon wasn't deception, it was imagination. And imagination, once weaponized, never truly dies. The Ghost Army didn't die when its last member did. It just changed uniforms. Its spirit slipped quietly into new wars, new technologies, new frontiers. Every generation of warfare since 1945 has carried a piece of their DNA, that fusion of art and deceit, imagination and fear. The tools evolved, but the principle remained the same. Control what the enemy believes, and you control the war. During the Korean War, deception officers studied the 23rd's field manuals. They built fake airfields along the 38th parallel, complete with dummy jets and burning fuel barrels to lure enemy bombers. It worked. The Chinese and North Koreans wasted precious resources attacking plywood and paint. In Vietnam, American engineers revived another Ghost Army trick, recorded sound. This time it wasn't engines or artillery they projected into the jungle, but voices. The operation was called Wandering Soul. Through loudspeakers hidden in trees, they broadcast ghostly wails in Vietnamese, the voices of fallen soldiers calling to their comrades from the afterlife. The goal wasn't to kill, but to haunt. Many Viet Cong units fled positions without firing a shot. The ghosts were back, wearing new masks. By the time the Gulf War came, the art had become science. The U.S. military filled the Arabian Desert with inflatable Patriot missiles, fake tanks, and dummy aircraft that glowed with convincing infrared signatures. Satellites and radar couldn't tell the difference. The decoys absorbed more than 30% of Iraqi missile fire. Rubber and aluminum foil saving real lives. Every modern deception campaign traces its lineage to those muddy fields in France, to those sound trucks blasting recorded chaos through the night. When military theorists speak of cognitive warfare, they're really just speaking a new dialect of the Ghost Army's old language. And what about the other side? Oh, they learned too. The Soviets became masters of maskirovka, camouflage and deception so intricate it blurred the line between defense and theater. They faked entire missile bases, projected false troop counts, even hid the construction of nuclear submarines beneath the noise of routine drills. Their generals studied the 23rd's operations obsessively. Some Soviet officers called them the magicians of war. Decades later, Russian disinformation campaigns on the internet would weaponize the same principle. Only now, the ghosts didn't need rubber tanks. They had pixels, tweets, deepfakes, the same battlefield, just digitized, the same strategy, just faster. The ghosts had gone global. Yet something about the originals remains unmatched. Maybe because their illusions were human, built by hand, crafted in mud, and smoke by men who understood both art and fear. There's something intimate about that kind of deception, something almost beautiful in its madness. When historians read their field notes, it feels less like military paperwork and more like a director's notebook. Sunlight must hit canvas at 45 degrees to simulate steel. Paint shadows under barrel to suggest depth. Move fake tire tracks toward tree line to imply recent movement. It's choreography, a dance of details meant to seduce the enemy's eyes. And it worked because it was rooted in empathy. Those artists understood how a German reconnaissance pilot would think, what he'd expect to see, how he'd interpret a plume of smoke or a patch of mud. They didn't just trick the enemy, they understood him. That's why it works so well. It's strange, but there's a kind of poetry in that. They studied their adversaries not to kill them, but to fool them into not fighting. Maybe that's the most moral act imaginable in war, using deception to prevent destruction. When war historians talk about soft power or psychological dominance, they're really describing the legacy of the 23rd. It's not about lying for victory. It's about replacing slaughter with imagination, bombs with brushstrokes. Because here's the truth that the Germans learned the hard way. The most powerful weapon in any army's arsenal isn't made of metal or explosives. It's belief. Once you seize that, once you control what your opponent thinks is true, the battle is already over. That's why the Ghost Army mattered. They didn't just fool the Germans. They rewired the future of warfare itself. Today, the U.S. Army Psychological Operations Units trace their heritage directly to the 23rd. Their motto is a whisper of that old spirit: persuade, change, influence. Their insignia features a dagger crossed with a lightning bolt, a nod to speed, precision, and unseen strikes. In their training manuals, there's an early line from one of the Ghost Army's commanders: deception is truth applied at an angle. And that line still defines modern conflict. Now, deception isn't done with rubber and canvas, but with data and light. Digital ghosts instead of physical ones. Fake satellite images instead of fake tank shadows. But the intent hasn't changed since 1944. Distort perception, delay reaction, and dominate the narrative. When generals today look back on the Ghost Army, they don't just see nostalgia. They see a warning. Because the same weapon that can save lives by confusing an enemy can also destroy truth when turned inward. The ghosts that once protected soldiers can now haunt societies. Misinformation, propaganda, deep-fake wars. The ghosts are everywhere again. But this time, they fight in the minds of civilians. And if you listen closely, you can still hear them whispering through the static of modern wars. Reality is what we make it. The German officers who once scoffed at the idea of fake tanks could never have imagined that one day entire governments would be built on illusion. The ghosts showed the world a truth that's both inspiring and terrifying, that imagination, when disciplined, is stronger than force. They ended their war with rubber and sound. We fight ours with code and light. But it's the same old magic trick. Make the world see what isn't there, and it will destroy itself trying to prove it's real. That's the Ghost Army's true legacy, not just in history, but in every war that's fought inside a mind.